The year was 1925. China had been without an emperor for 13 years, yet the nation was still broken and bleeding. Military leaders fought each other across the land, commanding armies that totaled 1.5 million soldiers. In Beijing, the old capital, people wept for Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary hero who had just died. Many had believed he could bring peace and hope to their troubled country. Even though Sun Yat-sen was gone, his dream lived on. He had wanted to crush the military strongmen and bring all of China under one government. Now this mission fell to his follower, a 37-year-old man named Ji. The Western world knew him better as Chang. Chang ran the Kuomintang's military school at Wampu. People saw him as someone who could inspire others, get things done, and reach for power. He had studied war in Japan, where he first met Sun Yat-sen back in 1908. That meeting changed his life and made him join the fight for a new China. When Sun Yat-sen died, military strongmen controlled most of China. These were greedy generals and local bosses who had their own private armies. They cared only about themselves and their own power. They ruled their territories like kings. The Kuomintang, which people also called the Nationalists, only controlled the southern areas, Guangxi and Guangdong provinces. Their main city was Canton. To get stronger, they had made a shaky deal with the Communist Party. Together, they formed what was called the First United Front. This partnership meant they could get help from Soviet Russia. But many Kuomintang members, including Chang himself, didn't trust the Soviets. Chang had recently visited Russia and came back convinced that communism would never work in China. Still, people across China were hungry for change. They were tired of the chaos, the fighting warlords, and foreign countries meddling in their affairs. During 1925, workers and people who hated foreign control began rising up. When international police in Shanghai shot at protesters, workers in southern cities went on strike. Both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party gained thousands of new members. But the suspicion between these unlikely partners never went away. In 1926, Chang decided to act first. He claimed that communists were plotting against him and launched his own surprise attack. He put Canton under military control and had his political enemies arrested or kicked out of the country. This included Soviet advisors. He also threw communists out of the Whampoa military academy, including a rising communist star named Zhou Enlai, who was only 28 years old. This bold move made Chang's control over both the Kuomintang military and the Nationalist Party much stronger. Surprisingly, the Soviets still agreed to keep supporting him militarily because they desperately wanted to keep some influence in China. The First United Front barely survived. Now Chang was ready to fulfill Sun Yat-sen's final wish, a northern expedition to defeat China's warlords and unite the entire country under Kuomintang rule. The most powerful warlord in northern China was Zhongzhou. He controlled the Beiyang government in Beijing, which other countries still recognize as China's official government. In central China, the main figure was Wu Peifu, known as the Jade Marshal. His partner, Sun Quanfang, ruled several eastern provinces and controlled the important cities of Nanjing and Shanghai. In the south, Chang commanded the National Revolutionary Army, which had 100,000 soldiers. He knew that when he marched north, his enemies would greatly outnumber his forces. However, his troops were better trained and had modern Soviet weapons. He also had friendly warlords on his side, Li Zongren, Feng Yuxiang, and Yan Shi. Chang planned to move north step by step, carefully defeating each hostile warlord. In the early months of the war, his northern expedition moved forward quickly. By April, the Kuomintang controlled southern China's most important cities, including Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanjing. First Wu Peifu fell. Then Sun Quanfang was driven from his strongholds. Only Zhang Zuolin remained in the north. Many warlord soldiers switched sides and joined Chang's army, making his National Revolutionary Army grow to an enormous force of 700,000 men. Victory in a united China seemed close. As National Revolutionary Army troops marched toward Beijing, old tensions between the Kuomintang and communist factions came back. Chiang Kai-shek grew more suspicious of his Soviet advisors and worried about the communists' growing boldness. His fears seemed proven right as his army approached Shanghai. A few days before they arrived, Zhou Enlai and other communists used a workers' revolt to take control of the city. But Chang had his own powerful friends in Shanghai. Du Yusheng, nicknamed Begia Du, was a crime boss who ruled Shanghai's underworld. He was also Chang's personal ally. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1927, Du ordered his Green Gang to attack the communists and union leaders who had taken over the city. Thousands of Shanghai workers poured into the streets to protest. Chang's Kuomintang soldiers opened fire on them. Over the following days and weeks, about 12,000 communists were killed or disappeared in Shanghai alone. The First United Front had ended in bloodshed and betrayal. This Shanghai massacre was only the beginning. The Kuomintang began hunting down communists everywhere they controlled. The communists fought back by starting uprisings across the country. Zhou Enlai, who barely escaped Shanghai alive, led an armed revolt against Kuomintang rule in Nanjing. The next month, Mao Zedong led the Autumn Harvest Uprising in December. A third uprising happened in Canton. All three revolts were quickly crushed by Kuomintang forces. But But there was no doubt that a brutal new phase had begun in China's revolutionary struggles. While the communists fought to survive, Chiang's northern expedition continued moving forward. He now targeted the last hostile warlord standing, Zhang Zu, on June 6, 1928. In a moment full of meaning, Kuomintang troops entered Beijing, the old imperial capital. Zhang retreated beyond the Great Wall into Manchuria, a region where Japan had heavy political and economic influence. A large Japanese military force called the Kuomintang Army was stationed there. The Japanese had supported Jiang for several years, but now decided he was no longer useful. As Zhang traveled north by train, his car was destroyed by a massive bomb planted by a Japanese officer. The Japanese military hoped for better results from Jiang's 27-year-old son, Zhang Zu, but the young marshal, as people called him, had his own plans. In July, Zhang Jr. began talks with the Kuomintang. In exchange for promising loyalty to Chiang, he would keep control of his father's old territory in northeast China. Finally, after 10 years of internal fighting, China was unified, with one flag, one capital, and one leader. But it wouldn't be long before he faced his first major rebellion. In 1929, Chiang proposed a major reorganization of the National Revolutionary Army. He wanted to cut its size in half, from around 1.5 million men to 715,000, and split its troops into 65 divisions of 11,000 men each. His generals, many of whom had previously served China's warlords, correctly saw this as an attempt to weaken their power. A group of them formed an anti-Chiang coalition and threw China back into civil war. The Central Plains War, as it became known, pitted Kuomintang forces against their former warlord allies. Around 1 million soldiers took part in the fighting. Chiang Kai-shek suffered several early defeats but eventually regained control, thanks to support from Zhang, the young marshal. Victory came at enormous human and economic cost. After a generation of revolution and war, Chiang Kai-shek had once more proven his military authority over the country. Now he faced the next overwhelming challenge: to transform the Republic of China into a united, prosperous, independent nation. Chiang established his one-party government in Nanjing, a former capital of the Ming dynasty. These years became known as the Nanjing Decade, a period of sustained Kuomintang rule across eastern China at least. In reality, the country's unity was fragile and mostly on paper. Only Nanjing and its surrounding area were under direct Kuomintang control. Most of the country was still governed by warlords who were more or less loyal to Chiang's government. The communists, meanwhile, were wounded but not destroyed, and formed pockets of resistance throughout the country. In power, Chiang Kai-shek, referred to as the commander-in-chief or General, became increasingly harsh and controlling. To unite the country around a homegrown alternative to communism, he launched the New Life movement, bringing back Confucian ideas, updated for modern times. Chiang's wife, Sung Meiling, who was educated in America and came from a prominent Chinese Christian family, played a leading role. The New Life movement had limited impact, but by the early 1930s, parts of China were rapidly modernizing. New laws promoted equality between men and women and protected women's rights in marriage and property ownership. Education continued to spread. Newspapers, magazines, and journals multiplied. New movie theaters and playhouses opened. Infrastructure projects helped the Chinese economy develop industry. There was also huge foreign investment, especially from Japan. Though people complained about widespread corruption within Chiang's inner circle, yet 85% of China's population were farmers. Their situation had not improved since the time of the Qing dynasty. They remained desperately poor and gained little from developments in cities like Nanjing and Shanghai. The countryside of China was facing a terrible crisis. Farmers couldn't grow enough food because their soil was worn out and washing away. Land prices kept going up, making life even harder. The ruling Kuomintang party paid little attention to these struggling rural communities, but the Communist Party saw an opportunity and began spreading their ideas throughout the farming areas. Then disaster struck in 1931. Massive floods swept across central and eastern China, causing unbelievable damage. Between 1 and 4 million people died in what became one of history's worst natural disasters. While China was dealing with all these problems at home, other countries saw a chance to take advantage of the chaos. Japan had been growing its territory for many years by taking land from its neighbors. Now, with growing military power and national pride, some Japanese leaders saw China as their next target. Japan already controlled many businesses, train lines, and mines in northeast China. They wanted to take over all of Manchuria, because it had valuable natural resources that Japan needed. On September 18, 1931, something happened near the city of Mukden that would change everything. An explosion damaged part of a Japanese-owned railway, but this wasn't an accident or an attack by Chinese forces. Japanese military officers had planted the bomb themselves to create an excuse for invasion. Despite protests from China and other countries, Japanese forces launched their attack. In just 3 months, they controlled most of northeast China. They pushed back the Chinese forces led by a general nicknamed the Young Marshal. All of China was angry about this invasion, but their leader Chiang Kai-shek refused to start a full war with Japan. He believed in dealing with problems inside China first. then worrying about outside threats later. Chiang's plan was to give up territory temporarily to buy time. He told his generals to retreat rather than fight. Japan then created a fake country in northeast China called Manchuria. They put China's former Emperor Puyi on the throne as their puppet ruler. He was only 26 years old and had no real power. Chiang Kai-shek believed the communists were a bigger threat to his government than the Japanese were. Only about 10,000 communist party members had survived the violent attacks of 1927, but they had rebuilt their strengths in China's rural areas. They formed several small governments in remote countryside regions. The most successful was called the Jiangxi Soviet. The leader of this communist territory was Mao Zedong. His father had been a successful farmer, and Mao was one of the original founders of China's Communist Party. Now he controlled the Jiangxi Soviet, which governed over 3 million people. They had their own banks, money, and tax system. However, other communist leaders criticized Mao for being too harsh in removing his opponents, and he lost some of his influence. Zhou Enlai took over military leadership instead. The Jiangxi Soviet showed what a communist-controlled China might look like. For the Kuomintang government, this was extremely dangerous. Chiang Kai-shek planned several military campaigns to surround and destroy his army faced strong resistance from the Communist Red Army. The first 4 attempts to destroy the communist base all failed. The fighting between these two Chinese groups was incredibly brutal and caused massive suffering. Ordinary people, mostly poor farmers, got caught between two ruthless armies. Both sides carried out mass killings and tortured or shot anyone they suspected of being Even Mao's own wife was killed by Kuomintang forces when she refused to speak against her husband. Nobody knows exactly how many people died during this phase of China's civil war, but it may have been as many as 500,000. Finally, in September 1934, Chiang Kai-shek gathered nearly 1 million soldiers to completely surround and destroy the Jiangxi Soviet. This time, the weakened communists couldn't hold their position. They slowly lost ground until only about 100,000 soldiers and civilians remained in a small area around the city of Rui. The communist leaders made a desperate decision to abandon their base and escape to fight again later. Many died trying to break through the Kuomintang forces surrounding them. The survivors began an incredible journey that lasted a full year. Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong led them across some of China's most dangerous territory. They battled enemy forces, starvation, and exhaustion along the way. Less than 1 in 10 of the original Jiangxi communists completed the 6,000-mile journey to reach Yan'an, where they joined up with other communist groups from around the country. This amazing achievement became a legendary story for the Chinese Communist Party, known as the Long March. Mao's leadership during this difficult time helped him become the undisputed leader of the party, beating out rivals who were supported by the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Chinese Communist Party would follow Mao's ideas rather than orders from Moscow. For the moment, the communists seemed defeated. They had been badly weakened and were hiding in remote areas, but their situation was about to change dramatically. In December 1936, Chiang Kai-shek traveled to Xi'an in northern China to meet with a young marshal. His forces were leading the fight against the communists in their new northern hideout. 8 years had passed since the young marshal's father was killed by the Japanese. 3 years after that, Japanese forces had driven his army out of Manchuria. The young marshal was furious that Chiang refused to fight the Japanese invaders. He came up with a daring plan. He kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek and forced him to negotiate directly with the Zhou Enlai represented the communist side in these talks. After 2 weeks of intense discussions, Chiang Kai-shek finally agreed to their demands. Chiang promised to stop the civil war and join forces against Japan before he was released. Once he returned safely to the capital city of Nanking, he immediately put the young marshal under house arrest. But he kept his most important promise. Chiang agreed to form an alliance with his communist enemies, creating what was called the Second United Front to fight Japan together. On the evening of July 7, 1937, a small group of Japanese soldiers demanded to enter the walled town of Wamping, near Beijing. They claimed they were looking for a missing soldier. The Chinese guards refused to let them in. Tension built up quickly between the two sides. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out from the Chinese position. Both sides immediately started shooting at each other. This small incident triggered one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century. What started as a minor confrontation would soon engulf all of China and eventually become part of the larger World War II conflict that would reshape the entire world.